When Rupert Taylor pulled over for a soaked stranger, he had no idea it would change the way he buried his father, and the way he carried his name. But what could possibly connect one trucker, a dying veteran, and dozens of roaring motorcycles? The rain had been falling since dusk, blurring the lines between road and horizon. Rupert gripped the wheel, wipers losing their fight. His father, Walter, had always cursed storms, said they made men sloppy. Rupert could still hear that gravelly voice, though in life he hadn't heard it for weeks, except in clipped updates from the hospital. At 52, Rupert was more machine than man. Wake, drive, eat, sleep, repeat. Silence filled the cracks until it felt normal, but that night it pressed heavier, maybe because he knew his father was running out of time. The high beams cut through the downpour, illuminating a shape up ahead. At first it looked like nothing more than a shadow against the guardrail, but as Rupert drew closer, the outline sharpened. A man standing beside a motorcycle. The bike was a Harley, chrome dulled by rain, its rider drenched through his leather vest and jeans. He wasn't waving, wasn't trying to flag anyone down. Just standing there, arms crossed, jaw set, as if daring the storm to wash him away. Rupert's instinct was automatic. Keep driving. Stranded bikers meant trouble more often than not. He'd heard the stories, setups for robberies, confrontations that ended with more than words. He even pressed the accelerator for a moment, telling himself it wasn't his problem. But something in the man's posture cut through his caution. It wasn't desperation, not exactly, but pride hanging on by a thread. He looked soaked to the bone yet too stubborn to beg. Rupert cursed under his breath, checked the mirror, and eased onto the shoulder 100 yards past the bike. The rig hissed as he braked. Rain hammered the roof like nails. He sat there for a long second, asking himself what the hell he thought he was doing, then shoved the shifter into reverse and backed slowly until he was level with the biker. The man turned his head but didn't move right away. When he finally stepped toward the cab, his boots splashed against the pooling water on the asphalt. Rupert rolled down the passenger window a crack. "You stuck or just out here enjoying the weather?" Rupert asked, his tone dry, a weak attempt at humor that didn't quite land. The biker gave a small shrug. His voice, when it came, carried the slow drawl of the South. "Bike won't fire. Nearest station's 10 miles back. Guess I misjudged the storm." "Guess so," Rupert muttered. He studied the man for a beat. The square jaw, the mustache darkened by rain, eyes sharp even under dripping hair. There was no slur in his words, no twitchy desperation, just a tired dignity. Against his better judgment, Rupert reached over and popped the door. "Get in before you drown." The biker climbed in, dripping across the worn seat. He smelled of wet leather and engine oil, not unpleasant, just strong. He settled in with a quiet nod. "Appreciate it. Name's Texas." Rupert raised a brow. "That short for something?" Tex smirked faintly, the first crack of expression on his face. "Short for Texas. Folks started calling me that when I was a kid. It stuck." Rupert eased the truck back onto the highway. The cab filled with the low rumble of the engine and the hiss of water against glass. Neither man seemed in a hurry to fill the silence. That suited Rupert fine. Words had never come easy. Not with his father, not with anyone. It was Tex who spoke first, somewhere past the 2nd-mile marker. "You run these roads often?" "Enough," Rupert said. "Been hauling since I was 19. Don't know much else." Tex nodded, staring through the rain-streaked window. "My old man was a mechanic. Bikes mostly. Kept food on the table but not much else. Died when I was 12. Lot of empty space after that." Rupert felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't expected confession from a stranger. He kept his eyes on the road. "Mine's still alive," he said after a pause. "Barely. Vietnam vet. Hard man. He's in a hospital bed now, counting what days he's got left. Don't talk much." "That hard, huh?" "Hard enough that sometimes silence was easier than words," Rupert admitted. For a while they drove without speaking, the storm filling the gaps. Rupert found himself thinking about the last time he'd spoken to Walter face to face. It had been months before the hospital, months before the coughing fits turned into oxygen tubes and hushed calls from nurses. The conversation had been about money, about Rupert covering some bills. Walter had thanked him in the blunt way he always did. "You did your part." That was as close as he ever came to affection. Tex cleared his throat, breaking Rupert's reverie. "You know, people think men like our fathers didn't care, but some just didn't know how to show it. Pride's a prison that way." Rupert glanced at him, surprised at the insight. For a moment he saw not just a biker but someone who understood the weight of unfinished conversations, of love hidden in silence. They reached the lights of a service station, a lone beacon cutting through the rain. Rupert pulled off and rolled to a stop under the canopy. Tex pushed the door open and climbed out. He stood there for a second, dripping, then leaned back to the cab. "You didn't have to stop tonight. Most folks wouldn't." Rupert shrugged. "Storm like this, leaving a man out here felt wrong." Tex's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "If you ever need something, send a sign. Biker code." Rupert barked a short laugh. "Sure, I'll keep that in mind." Tex gave a half smile, tugged his vest tighter, and walked toward the payphone near the entrance. Rupert watched him for a moment, then shifted back into gear. The wipers slapped away the rain, the road opened again, and the stranger was swallowed by the night behind him. But the words lingered, carried on the hum of the engine. Biker code. Rupert shook his head, trying to dismiss it. Just a line from a drifter he'd never see again. Still, as he pushed the rig eastward, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, small but undeniable, like the first crack in a dam that had been holding for decades. It wasn't the storm that unsettled him, but the echo of a stranger's words lingering louder than the thunder. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind wet streets and a sky bruised with gray. Rupert's rig sat in the gravel lot of the small-town hospital, streaked with mud from the night's haul. He climbed down slowly, joints aching after another long run. For a moment he stood outside the entrance, staring at the sliding glass doors, wondering how many more times he'd walk through them before there was nothing left to visit. Inside, the halls smelled of antiseptic and overcooked coffee. Rupert nodded to the nurses at the desk, women who knew him by sight now, even if they never learned much about him beyond son of Walter Taylor, the veteran in room 208. He moved down the corridor with his usual heavy stride, boots echoing on the linoleum. Walter looked smaller than Rupert remembered. Each time he visited, the man seemed to shrink a little more, skin thinning, shoulders collapsing inward, chest rattling as machines kept his lungs steady. The same man who once shouldered engines barehanded now barely had the strength to turn his head. His eyes opened at Rupert's approach but didn't brighten. "You working?" Walter rasped. "Always," Rupert said, setting his hat on the chair. "Just dropped a load in Indiana. Swung through." Walter gave the faintest nod, then closed his eyes again. Conversation over. That was how it had always been. Clipped exchanges, work mentioned, then silence swallowing everything else. Rupert sat for an hour anyway, listening to the machines, watching the frail rise and fall of the chest that had once seemed indestructible. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words snagged in his throat. When the end came 2 nights later, Rupert wasn't there. A nurse called just after dawn. Heart failure, quick, painless. He thanked her, hung up, and sat on the edge of his bunk in the cab for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. He had told himself for months that he was ready. But when the call came, he realized readiness was a lie. Grief was a language he had forgotten how to speak. The days that followed blurred into paperwork, phone calls, and awkward conversations. Diane phoned once from Florida, her voice tight, defensive. "I can't come back," she said before he could even ask. "Not after the way he treated me. I said my goodbyes years ago." "You sure about that?" Rupert asked quietly. "I'm sure. Handle it, Rupee. You always did." The line went dead, leaving him with the same cold knot in his stomach he'd carried since they were kids. Diane had fought Walter in ways Rupert never dared, and the scars ran deeper in her. He couldn't blame her for staying away, but it left him alone to shoulder the weight. Back at the old family house, a sagging one-story with peeling paint and a shed that smelled of rust. Rupert began sorting through what was left. Bills, clothes, junk, mail piled high. But in the corner of the shed sat something that made him stop short. Walter's old red Craftsman toolbox. The metal was dented, the paint chipped, but Rupert knew it like he knew the lines on his own hands. He'd grown up watching his father pull wrenches from it, tightening bolts until midnight, cursing softly when parts didn't fit. He dragged it onto the workbench, the hinges squealing as it opened. Tools were scattered inside. Sockets, pliers, wrenches, each worn smooth from decades of use. But under a false bottom panel, Rupert found something else. A bundle of envelopes, yellowed with age, tied with greasy twine. His breath caught. Letters. Dozens of them. He unfolded the first, dated from the year Diane turned 15. Walter's handwriting was stiff, almost reluctant, the lines uneven. Diane, I don't say things right. I know that. I hope one day you'll understand I wasn't trying to be cruel. I just wanted you tough enough to face this world without me. Rupert sat heavily on the stool, letter trembling in his hands. He read another, addressed to no one, just a note about a night he couldn't sleep, where he admitted missing his late wife more than he could bear. Then he found one with his own name. The postmark space was blank, never mailed. On the envelope, written in block letters, Rupert, for when you're old enough. He opened it carefully, his throat dry. I never knew how to tell you I loved you without feeling weak. Men in my world didn't say it, they showed it. Maybe that's why I fixed your brakes, tightened your clutch, kept your truck running. Maybe that was my way. If you think I was hard, it's because I wanted you to last longer than me. You were always more than you knew. Forgive me for not saying it plain. Rupert lowered the page, his vision blurring. All the years of silence, the clipped conversations, the arguments left unfinished. They pressed down on him now with unbearable weight. His father hadn't been cruel. He'd been caged by his own pride. And Rupert had inherited that cage without even realizing it. He stayed in the shed for hours, reading letter after letter, piecing together fragments of a man he thought he'd known but never truly understood. Each note revealed a side of Walter hidden beneath the gruff exterior. The mechanic who once pushed a stranger's truck for miles in a snowstorm. The father who regretted missing school games. The veteran who dreamed of simpler days but could never admit it aloud. Together, they read less like memories and more like confessions, as if Walter had been whispering truths into the dark, waiting for his son to find them. By the time Rupert closed the box, night had settled in. The rain had returned, tapping lightly on the roof, but he barely noticed. He sat there in the dim light, surrounded by the smell of oil and steel, holding the words of a man who had never spoken them. Rupert whispered into the quiet, as if the shed itself might carry it somewhere his father could hear. I forgive you, Dad. The words echoed faintly, fragile but real. He didn't know if they were enough, but they were all he had. And in that moment, it was more than silence. The morning of the funeral carried a silence so sharp it felt like it could split stone. Frost clung to the grass, the fields lay bare, and the sky hung low with a dull gray that refused to lift. Rupert dressed slowly, fingers clumsy around the knot of his black tie. It was the same tie he had worn at his mother's service years earlier, the fabric stiff with age. He looked in the mirror, saw a man worn down by miles and silence, and wondered whether his father would have recognized him now. The road to Cedar Bluff Cemetery wound through stretches of farmland and broken fences. Rupert drove alone, his rig groaning beneath him, every mile heavier than the last. He kept glancing at the mirror, half hoping to see another car, Diane having changed her mind. But the mirror stayed empty. The cemetery was small, more forgotten than cared for. A rusted arch marked the entrance, and only a handful of vehicles sat scattered outside. Rupert parked, tugged his coat tighter, and walked the gravel path toward the open grave. The gathering was sparse, almost pitiful. Pastor Lenny stood with his Bible clutched to his chest. Two neighbors, the Averys, huddled together against the cold. The groundskeeper leaned on his shovel, expression blank. That was it. For people to send Walter Taylor into the ground. a man who had fought in Vietnam, raised 2 children, spent his life building engines and helping strangers. Rupert's stomach twisted at the sight. He nodded briefly at the pastor and stepped to the front. The casket lay on ropes above the grave, dark wood gleaming against the pale earth. Rupert rested a hand on it, rough palm against polished surface. He thought of the letters folded in his wallet, words his father had never spoken aloud, and for a fleeting second considered pulling one out to read. But the knot in his throat was too thick, his voice too uncertain. Pastor Lenny began the service. His words were simple, honest: duty, labor, sacrifice. The war, the years of hard work, the stubborn kind of dignity that defined men like Walter. Rupert bowed his head, but his mind wandered to nights in the shed, to the letter where his father admitted love had always come hidden inside an oil change or a clutch adjustment. The memory stung sharper than the cold air. The ropes creaked, lowering the casket inch by inch. The sound was final, echoing too loud in the empty space. Rupert's chest clenched. This was how it would end. A life reduced to a box in the ground, witnessed by a pastor, 2 elderly neighbors, and a son too broken to speak. Then the earth itself began to hum. At first it was faint, like distant thunder rolling over the hills. But it grew louder, layered, steady, the sound of engines. Dozens of them. The mourners turned, faces puzzled. Rupert straightened, eyes narrowing toward the road. Over the rise, motorcycles appeared in formation. Chrome flashed under the weak morning sun. Headlights cut through the mist. 2 by 2 they came, not 5 or 10 but more than 30, maybe 40. The sound shook the ground, a wave of thunder rolling into the quiet graveyard. The bikes slowed as they entered, then cut their engines in unison. Silence followed, heavy and deliberate. The riders dismounted, boots crunching on gravel, helmets removed. Leather vests bore the unmistakable patch of the Hells Angels. At the front stood Texas. Rupert's breath caught. The man he had picked up on a stormy night now stood before him, flanked by an army of chrome and steel. Tex stepped forward, voice low but carrying across the cemetery. "You gave me a ride in the rain. That matters. But more than that, your father mattered. Men like him don't go to the ground alone." An older biker with a thick gray beard moved beside Texas. "Name's Bear," he said, gravel in his tone. "Your dad once pulled me out of a ditch outside Louisville. Rig busted, night colder than death. He fixed me up, refused a dime. Told me, a man doesn't charge to pull another out. Been carrying those words ever since." Rupert felt something break loose inside him. The letters in his wallet burned against his chest. His father had lived the same code with strangers that he'd struggled to show his own children. Quiet, stubborn, but never absent. The bikers moved into formation, lining the path on either side of the grave. Heads bowed, arms crossed. It was a sight Rupert would never forget. A wall of leather and steel standing in tribute. When Pastor Lenny closed his prayer, Tex lifted a hand. Engines roared to life in unison. The thunder rolled through the hills, deafening, fierce, but full of reverence. The roar wasn't noise. It was a hymn in steel and gasoline, a language no preacher could have spoken better. Rupert's tears came without restraint. For years he had carried them like a burden, swallowed down the grief, hardened himself in silence. The engines gave him permission to break, to weep like a boy at the edge of his father's workbench, when words had never been enough. Tears came heavy, not only for the man in the ground, but for the time wasted, the words unsaid, and the father he understood too late. When the sound faded, the angels mounted their bikes once more. Tex lingered just long enough to place a gloved hand on Rupert's shoulder. "He's not forgotten. Neither are you." Then the convoy rolled out, engines echoing across the countryside until only silence remained. Rupert stood by the grave, alone again, but no longer empty. He believed his father's life had been seen, honored, and carried forward. The roar of the motorcycles lingered in Rupert's ears long after the convoy disappeared over the rise. Standing by the grave, his eyes swollen from tears, he felt an emptiness he couldn't name, but it wasn't the same emptiness that had haunted him for years. It was lighter now, carved open by grief but filled by something unexpected. The weight of strangers who had chosen to stand beside him. The cemetery slowly emptied. Pastor Lenny pressed Rupert's hand with quiet sympathy. The Averys offered a casserole that he politely declined, and the groundskeeper lowered his head before returning to his shovel. Soon only Rupert remained. He traced the letters on his father's nameplate, still temporary, and whispered, "You weren't forgotten." For the first time, he believed it. Back at the old house, Rupert unpacked his father's toolbox again. The letters lay neatly stacked, but this time he didn't read them. He just rested his hand on the pile, as if the paper itself carried Walter's voice. A question stirred in him. How many lives had his father touched with these quiet acts? How many stories like bears were out there waiting to be told? The phone rang that evening. It was Diane. Her voice trembled, though she tried to hide it. "I heard about what happened," she said. "The motorcycles." Someone posted a picture online. "Was that real?" "Real as the dirt on his grave," Rupert replied. Silence stretched between them. Then softer, "I should have been there." Rupert closed his eyes. "He'd have wanted you to come. But I get why you didn't." "I thought he didn't love us," Diane whispered. Rupert hesitated, then pulled the folded letter from his wallet. He just didn't know how to say it. "I've got proof." Diane didn't hang up. They talked until the line crackled with fatigue. It wasn't peace yet, but it was the first plank of a bridge stretched over years of distance. Weeks passed. Rupert returned to the road, hauling loads across state lines, the rhythm of diesel and asphalt steadying him. Yet the memory of the funeral never left. Every time he heard the low growl of a bike in the distance, his chest tightened, and he found himself scanning the mirrors, half expecting to see Tex again. One afternoon, in a truck stop diner in Missouri, Rupert caught sight of a familiar patch. Two bikers sat at the counter, leather vests worn, helmets at their feet. They noticed him too. One raised a mug in silent salute. Rupert hesitated, then nodded back. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them. Recognition, respect, a quiet belonging. It unsettled him. He had never thought of himself as belonging to anything. Trucking was solitary, his family fractured. And yet, because of one rainy night and one silent father, he had been pulled into a brotherhood he hadn't asked for but now couldn't ignore. The true test came a month later. On a sun-faded stretch of highway in Oklahoma, Rupert spotted a young biker stranded by the shoulder, crouched over a flat tire. The rider couldn't have been more than 20, lanky arms covered in grease, face hidden under a cap. Cars sped past without slowing. Rupert felt the old instinct, keep driving, let someone else handle it. But another memory struck harder. Tex, soaked to the bone, standing proud in the storm. Bare, remembering Walter's words, the engines thundering for his father's honor. He slowed, checked the mirrors, and eased onto the shoulder. Climbing down from the cab, he called out, "Need a hand?" The kid looked up, startled, suspicion in his eyes. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his hands shook against the stubborn bolts. Rupert knelt beside the bike. "Yeah, I used to say that too. Doesn't make it true." He reached for the wrench and loosened the nuts with a practiced twist. The boy watched, hesitant at first, then relieved. Within minutes the tire was swapped, the bike ready to roll. The kid fumbled for his wallet. "How much do I owe you?" Rupert shook his head, wiping his hands on a rag. "Nothing. A man doesn't charge to pull another out of the ditch." The boy froze, recognition flashing in his eyes, though he couldn't have known where the phrase came from. He extended his hand. "Name's Eli. Thanks." Rupert clasped it firmly. "Rupert." As the bike roared back to life and Eli merged onto the highway, Rupert stood by his rig, the wind tugging at his coat. He realized he had just carried forward what his father had lived. A code of action, not words. And it felt right. That night, parked at a rest area beneath a sky littered with stars, Rupert sat on his bunk and unfolded Walter's letter once more. He read the lines slowly, lips moving with each word. "Maybe fixing your brakes was my way of saying I loved you." Rupert smiled faintly, not bitter this time. He tucked the letter back into his wallet, next to his own logbook. He would carry it everywhere from now on, not as a weight but as a compass. The miles ahead no longer felt like chains. They felt like a compass, pointing him toward a life where silence could finally give way to action. As the hum of passing traffic rocked the cab, Rupert whispered into the quiet, "You're still riding with me, Dad." And in the silence that followed, he almost believed he could hear the distant thunder of engines answering back. This story reminds us that love isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's carried in the weight of an engine, a helping hand, or the silence between men. What would you have done in Rupert's place? Would you have stopped for text that rainy night? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more tales of redemption and honor. See you in the next video.